Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
There are moments in life when you realize, with a clarity so sharp it cuts straight through your heart, that the people who are supposed to love you the most have made a choice, a deliberate, conscious choice, to leave you out. To erase you from the parts of their lives they deem important, to push you so far into the background that you may as well not exist at all. And that's exactly how I felt when I found out, entirely by accident, that my own mother was getting married and had somehow managed to forget to invite me. I had been sitting in my apartment, mindlessly scrolling through emails, debating whether to order takeout or actually cook for once, when my phone rang, my cousin Maria's name flashing across the screen. She was the kind of person who never called without a reason, and I remember answering with a casual, "Hey, what's up?" completely unaware that in the next 30 seconds, my entire world was about to tilt off its axis. Her voice had been light, excited, like she was asking about something as simple as a family barbecue or a holiday dinner, not something that would make my stomach drop to the floor. "So, what are you wearing to the wedding?" she asked, as if I already knew exactly what she was talking about, as if this was a conversation we had already had. As if there was no possible way I wouldn't be involved in something as monumental as my own mother's wedding. For a moment, I didn't even respond, just sat there in stunned silence, my mind struggling to process the words, trying to find some way to make them make sense, trying to convince myself that I had misheard, that this wasn't what I thought it was, that she was talking about someone else entirely. And then, when the silence stretched too long, when Maria made a soft, nervous noise on the other end of the line, I finally found my voice, though it came out sharper than I intended. "What wedding?" There was an immediate pause, a hesitation so thick I could practically feel her scrambling for an explanation, for a way out of the hole she had just accidentally dug for herself, but it was too late, because I already knew. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, more cautious, laced with the kind of guilt that told me she had just realized she had been the one to spill the secret. Oh God, you don't know, do you?" I felt something cold settle in my stomach, something heavy and sinking and impossible to ignore, and I could already feel the anger bubbling up inside me, could already feel my hands tightening into fists, could already hear the blood rushing in my ears as I forced myself to stay calm. "No, Maria," I said, keeping my voice as even as I could manage. "I don't know. Why don't you tell me?" She tried to backpedal, stumbling over her words, saying something about how she just assumed I had already heard, how she figured my mother had told me, how she never would have brought it up if she had known I was being left out. But I had stopped listening, because the only thing that mattered was the undeniable truth that had just been laid out in front of me. My mother was getting married, my sister's entire family had been invited, and I hadn't even been given the courtesy of a phone call. I don't remember hanging up. I don't remember grabbing my keys. I don't remember driving to my mother's house, my knuckles white against the steering wheel, my heart pounding so hard in my chest it felt like it might burst. But I do remember standing in her kitchen, staring at her as she casually poured herself a cup of coffee, completely unfazed by my presence, completely unaffected by the storm raging inside me. "So," I said, my voice colder than I had ever heard it, "when were you planning on telling me?" She didn't even look up, just stirred her cream into her coffee like we were having a normal conversation, like this wasn't a betrayal of the deepest kind. Like this was just another insignificant moment in a long history of her making me feel like I didn't belong. "Telling you what?" she asked, as if she truly didn't know what I was referring to, as if this was some minor misunderstanding instead of what it actually was, a knife in my back. "The wedding," I bit out, my hands shaking at my sides. "The one you invited everyone to accept for me." That's when she finally looked at me, and I don't know what I expected to see in her face: guilt, regret, even a flicker of embarrassment, but what I got instead was something far worse. A smirk. A small, barely there smirk that she tried to hide behind a sip of coffee, but I saw it. I felt it. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said, waving a dismissive hand like I was a child throwing a tantrum over something insignificant. "We didn't think you'd care." "We." Not I. "We." She wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for my sister, for the rest of the family, for every single person who had been in on this and said nothing. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away, not just because of this one moment, but because of everything that had come before it. The years of being treated like an afterthought, the constant favoritism, the subtle but deliberate ways she had always made it clear that my sister was the one who mattered, that I was nothing more than a shadow in the background of their perfect little family. I forced a smile, my hands curling into fists so tightly that my nails dug into my palms, the pain grounding me, keeping me from screaming, from throwing something, from giving her the reaction she so clearly wanted. "You're right," I said, my voice calm, too calm. "I don't care. Not one bit." I turned and walked out of that house, but as I drove home, my mind was already spinning, my pulse thrumming with something dark and unrelenting. If she thought I didn't care, I would show her just how much I didn't care. She and her perfect little wedding could go on exactly as planned, without me, without my presence, without my approval. But the reception? That was mine. And I was going to make sure she never forgot it. I sat in my apartment long after the confrontation with my mother, the silence pressing against me like a heavy weight, my mind spinning with thoughts I couldn't seem to stop, each one dragging me further down a path I had walked 1,000 times before. This wasn't just about the wedding. It wasn't just about this one event, this one betrayal, this one moment that made my stomach twist with something dark and ugly. No, this had been happening for years, for decades, for as long as I could remember, a slow, steady erosion of any illusion I had ever held that my mother saw me as anything more than an afterthought. I closed my eyes and let the memories come, uninvited but relentless, each one another reminder of how long I had been treated like I was something less, something disposable, something unworthy of the same love and attention she so freely gave to my sister. I remembered the birthdays where my gifts were an afterthought, hastily wrapped in the same generic paper she used for groceries, while my sister got elaborate parties with balloons and cakes and presents stacked so high they barely fit in the car. I remembered the school plays where I scanned the audience for her face, only to find an empty seat where she was supposed to be, while my sister's every dance recital, every spelling bee, every meaningless achievement was met with flowers and applause. I remembered the college graduation where she arrived late, claiming traffic, but still somehow managed to make it to my sister's earlier that year with time to spare, sitting proudly in the front row as if she had personally guided her to that moment. And now, here I was again, the same forgotten daughter, the same invisible presence, the same outsider looking in on a family that had never truly felt like mine. But this time, something was different. This time, I wasn't just going to sit back and take it. This time, I was going to find out exactly how deep this particular betrayal went, because the more I thought about it, the more I realized that my mother hadn't just forgotten to invite me, she had made sure I wasn't there. The first person I called was Maria, my cousin, the one who had unknowingly let the truth slip in the first place, and when she picked up, I could hear the guilt in her voice before she even said a word. "I'm so sorry," she blurted out immediately, not even giving me a chance to speak, her words tumbling over each other in a rush. "I thought you knew, I really did. I never would have said anything if I had realized." "Maria," I interrupted, my tone sharper than I intended, but I didn't have the patience for small talk, didn't have the energy for her excuses, didn't have time to pretend that I wasn't already 3 steps ahead of whatever damage control she was about to attempt. "I need you to tell me everything. Right now. Who planned this wedding? When did they start? Who decided I wasn't invited?" She hesitated, and for a moment, I thought she might try to lie, might try to protect whatever fragile balance she thought still existed between me and the rest of the family. But I wasn't going to let her off that easily. "Maria," I said again, my voice quieter this time, but firmer, more dangerous. "Tell me the truth." She exhaled heavily, and when she finally spoke, her voice was lower, like she was afraid someone might overhear. "Your mom and Beth planned everything together," she admitted, referring to my sister in a way that made my skin crawl, as if she were just another co-conspirator in a crime that had been perfectly orchestrated against me. "It started a few months ago, Maybe longer. I don't know the exact date, but I do know they talked about the guest list early on. And your name never came up. I swallowed the bitterness rising in my throat, but Maria wasn't finished. I asked about it once. She continued, sounding nervous now, like she wished she had never said anything at all. Not to them, just to Aunt Carol, because I thought maybe you were out of town or something. And she just gave me this weird look and said, "Oh, I don't think that's an accident." I felt my hands curl into fists, my nails digging into my palms as my mind processed what she was telling me, the pieces snapping together with a clarity that made my stomach twist. My mother hadn't just forgotten to invite me. She hadn't just assumed I wouldn't care. She had deliberately removed me from the equation, had made sure that I was never even considered, had erased me from this event before I even had the chance to reject it myself. And that meant one thing: she didn't want me there, not because she thought I wouldn't care, but because my presence would have ruined whatever perfect little image she was trying to create. I let out a slow breath, steadying myself, forcing the rage down just enough to think clearly, to see the situation for exactly what it was. This wasn't just about the wedding. This was about control. This was about power. This was about making sure that I knew exactly where I stood in this family, about reminding me, one last time, that I would never be her favorite, never be the one she chose, never be the one she loved the most. And that was fine. Because if she didn't want me there, if she had gone out of her way to make sure I was left out, if she had made absolutely certain that my name wasn't even whispered in conversation while this wedding was being planned, then I was going to return the favor in the only way I knew how. I wasn't going to fight her. I wasn't going to beg for an invitation. I wasn't going to demand an explanation. Instead, I was going to let her have her wedding, let her smile and bask in the attention, let her stand there with her new husband, surrounded by the people she actually cared about, believing for even a second that she had won. And then, when she least expected it, when she thought everything had gone exactly the way she wanted, when she believed she had successfully cut me out of her life for good, I was going to take it all away. I sat in my car outside the lavish wedding venue, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, my pulse thrumming in my ears as I watched guests filter inside, dressed in their finest clothes, laughing and chatting as if this was just another perfect day. As if there wasn't something rotten festering beneath the surface of it all. The golden glow of the chandeliers spilled out through the enormous floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the grand entrance where my mother's friends and family gathered, a seamless, polished picture of elegance and celebration, one that I was never meant to be a part of. I could feel the anger simmering beneath my skin, but it wasn't the kind that burned hot and reckless, wasn't the kind that made people lash out without thinking, wasn't the kind that could be dismissed as simple jealousy or bitterness. No, this was something different, something colder, something sharper, something calculated and deliberate, something that had been brewing since the moment my mother looked me in the eye and told me, with a smirk on her lips and cruelty in her voice, that she didn't think I would care. I watched the guests, scanning their faces, searching for some sign of discomfort, some flicker of guilt, some hesitation that suggested even one of them had questioned why I wasn't here, why I wasn't among them, why I had been erased so effortlessly from this picture-perfect moment. But all I saw was contentment. All I saw was acceptance. All I saw was a family that had moved on without me, a family that hadn't even noticed I was gone. And then I saw her, Beth, my sister, standing near the entrance, her expensive dress hugging her body like it had been tailored just for her hair styled in the effortless way that always seemed to come naturally to her, her laugh carrying across the evening air as she leaned in close to a group of relatives who clung to her every word. She looked comfortable, at ease, completely unbothered by the fact that I wasn't there, completely unaware that I was watching, completely confident in her place at the center of everything, as if she had finally taken up the role she had always believed was hers. And that was when I knew. This wasn't just my mother's doing. Beth had known. Beth had been part of it. Beth had made sure that I was left out, that I was removed, that I was nothing more than an afterthought, that she could step into the space I once occupied without any resistance, without any competition. without any reminders that she wasn't the only daughter in this family. And the realization made something in me settle, made something in me harden, made every last trace of doubt disappear, because if there had been any part of me that still questioned whether I should be here, still wondered if maybe I was overreacting, still thought that maybe my mother had simply made a mistake, this was the proof I needed. I wasn't here to cause a scene. I wasn't here to beg for an explanation. I wasn't here to ask for a place at a table that had already been set without me. I was here to remind them that I existed. I stepped out of the car, smoothing down the dress I had chosen carefully, not too flashy, not too understated, just enough to blend in at first, just enough to slip through the cracks of their carefully curated evening without drawing immediate attention. The venue was too big, the crowd too large, the noise too distracting for anyone to notice me as I slipped inside, moving along the edges of the room, keeping to the shadows, letting my presence sink in slowly, letting the weight of what I was about to do settle over me like a second skin. I walked past tables covered in expensive linens, past waiters carrying trays of champagne, past relatives who had known me since childhood but didn't even glance in my direction, too consumed by their own conversations, too wrapped up in the perfect little event that had been planned without me. And then, as I reached the back of the room, as I stood there watching the celebration unfold before me, I heard the unmistakable sound of a microphone being tapped, the slight feedback cutting through the chatter, drawing the attention of every guest in the room. I turned toward the stage, toward the center of the grand ballroom, toward the podium where my mother and her new husband sat like royalty at the head table, smiling and nodding as Beth stepped forward, microphone in hand, her face glowing under the soft golden lights as she prepared to give what I could only assume was a carefully rehearsed speech about love, about family, about how honored she was to be standing there tonight. The rage that curled inside me was slow, steady, controlled, because this wasn't just a speech. This was my place. This was where I should have been standing. This was the moment that had been stolen from me. Beth smiled, letting the laughter and whispers die down before she spoke, her voice clear, confident, filled with warmth that made my skin crawl. I just want to take a moment to say how incredibly lucky I feel tonight, she began, her eyes scanning the room, her tone dripping with sincerity, her performance flawless. Not just because I get to celebrate the love between two amazing people, but because I get to stand here, surrounded by family, surrounded by the people who have always supported us, the people who have made us who we are. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, a few soft claps, a few nods, the kind of response that told me these people had already decided their roles, had already accepted their version of the story, had already bought into whatever narrative my mother and Beth had so carefully constructed. I clenched my jaw, letting my nails dig into my palm, forcing myself to stay still, to stay quiet, to wait just a little longer, to let them believe, for just a few more moments, that everything was going according to plan. Because if they thought I was going to sit back and watch, if they thought I was going to swallow my pride and leave quietly, if they thought I would let them erase me from my own family's history without a fight, they were wrong. The room was quiet in that heavy, expectant way that only happened in moments where people could sense that something was about to shift, something was about to break, something was about to unfold in a way that no one had planned for. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, thick and suffocating, the kind of silence that came just before a storm, the kind that made your pulse quicken even if you didn't understand why, the kind that warned people to brace themselves before everything they thought they knew came crashing down around them. Beth was still at the microphone, basking in the glow of her carefully crafted speech, her voice smooth and confident as she spoke about love, about family, about the importance of cherishing the people who had always been there for you, never faltering, never turning their backs, never leaving you behind. It was a cruel irony, really, the way she spoke with such certainty, the way she carried herself like she had earned this moment, the way she had effortlessly stepped into a role that had been carved out for her long before she ever had to fight for it. I could see my mother watching her with pride, her chin tilted slightly upward, her lips curved in the kind of pleased, satisfied smile that made my stomach twist, made my hands clench into fists at my sides, made my breath come a little too fast, a little too sharp. She looked so content, so perfectly at ease, so sure of herself in the knowledge that she had orchestrated this event flawlessly, that she had created exactly the kind of evening she had always dreamed of, that she had surrounded herself with the people she had chosen, her perfect daughter, her adoring family, her new husband who had no idea the kind of woman he had just married. And that was when I stepped forward. I didn't rush, didn't make a scene, didn't shove my way through the crowd or demand attention with some grand gesture, because I didn't need to. The moment I moved, the moment I took a slow, deliberate step toward the stage, the moment my heels clicked against the polished floor with just enough force to break through the delicate tension hanging in the air, people noticed. Heads turned. Conversations stuttered to a halt. A few guests exchanged uncertain glances, their expressions shifting from pleasant curiosity to confusion, to something heavier, something that tasted like unease. Beth faltered for just a fraction of a second, her fingers tightening around the microphone as she caught sight of me, as she realized, too late, that I was here, that I had been here all along. That whatever illusion she and my mother had tried to create was about to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. I didn't smile. I didn't acknowledge her. I just kept walking. The murmur of voices started to swell, soft at first, then louder, more urgent, like people were finally putting the pieces together, finally recognizing what was wrong, finally understanding that there was something standing in the middle of their perfect evening that didn't belong. I stopped just a few feet from the stage, lifted my chin, and let my gaze sweep over the crowd, making sure I had their full attention before I finally spoke. Funny thing about family, I said, my voice carrying through the silent room, smooth and steady, loud enough to cut through the last remnants of whispered speculation. You spend your whole life thinking that blood is supposed to mean something, that no matter what happens, no matter how many mistakes are made, no matter how many fights, how many disappointments, how many times you're hurt at the end of the day, family is supposed to be the one thing that never turns its back on you. A few people shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, their expressions wary, uncertain, because they still didn't understand what was happening, still didn't see the whole picture, still didn't realize that I wasn't just here to make a statement. I was here to burn everything down. Beth cleared her throat, her voice tight, forced, her smile frozen in place like she was still trying to control the narrative, still trying to hold on to the last threads of a performance that was slipping through her fingers. Maybe we should. I didn't let her finish. Imagine my surprise, I continued, my tone colder now, sharper, harder, when I found out that my mother, the woman who gave birth to me, the woman who was supposed to love me unconditionally, decided to get married without even telling me. Not only that, but she invited every single person in this room, people I've known my entire life, people who have sat at my dinner table, people who have called me family, and not one of them thought to question why I wasn't here. Not one of them thought to ask if I even knew. Not one of them cared enough to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I had been left out on purpose. A ripple of unease spread through the crowd, a few nervous coughs, a few hushed whispers, a few eyes darting toward my mother, who sat frozen at the head table, her smile gone, her posture rigid. Her fingers curled so tightly around the stem of her champagne glass that I thought it might snap in half. She opened her mouth, probably to lie, probably to tell the crowd that I was exaggerating, probably to spin the situation in her favor the way she always did, but I wasn't finished. "You didn't forget me," I said, my voice quieter now, but no less lethal. "You didn't assume I wouldn't care. You made sure I wasn't there. You planned it that way. You decided, months ago, that you wanted this wedding to be exactly the way you envisioned it, and that version of perfection didn't include me." A few gasps echoed through the room, a few faces paled, a few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing, maybe for the first time, that they had been complicit in something cruel, something calculated, something unforgivable. Beth took a step forward, her expression carefully neutral, but I could see the panic beneath the surface, the way her hands trembled slightly, the way she was already preparing to spin the situation back in her favor, to find a way to turn me into the villain. Look, I know this is upsetting, but I turned to face her fully, cutting her off with nothing more than a look, my pulse steady, my mind clear, my next words already forming in my head with the kind of certainty that sent a thrill through my veins. Because I wasn't done yet. I had saved the best for last. Beth's expression flickered for just a fraction of a second, her carefully curated confidence faltering as the weight of my words settled over the room, pressing down on every guest, suffocating in its intensity, undeniable in its truth. She had spent her entire life perfecting the role of the golden child, the obedient daughter, the one who could do no wrong in the eyes of our mother. But now, standing beneath the harsh glow of the ballroom lights, with the eyes of an entire wedding full of people locked onto her, she was no longer untouchable. She had spent so much time believing she was invincible, believing she could rewrite the story however she wanted, believing she could erase me from the picture without consequence, but she had never expected me to take back my place, never expected me to show up, never expected me to turn the entire night into something she couldn't control. She took a slow step toward me, her hands lifting slightly, her voice dropping into that condescending, patronizing tone she always used when she was trying to act like the bigger person, the rational one. The one who was simply trying to diffuse the situation rather than the one who had orchestrated it in the first place. "I really think you should calm down," she said, forcing a tight smile, her eyes scanning the crowd as if to make sure she still had them on her side, still had the advantage, still had a chance to pull this back in her favor. "I get that you're upset, and I get that this isn't how you wanted to find out about Mom's wedding, but this isn't the time or place to air whatever personal grievances you have against our family." I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head, because of course that was how she was going to play this, like I was the one making a scene, like I was the one ruining the evening. Like I was the one who had turned this into something ugly instead of the fact that they had made a choice weeks, months, maybe even years ago, to pretend I didn't exist. "You don't get to decide that," I said, my voice calm, too calm, my pulse steady as I took a step forward, closing the distance between us, refusing to let her shrink me down into the version of myself she had spent years trying to control. "You don't get to stand up here, in front of all these people, in front of your perfect little audience, and act like you and Mom didn't sit down and make a conscious decision to cut me out of this wedding, to erase me from my own family, to pretend that I don't matter. You don't get to lie your way out of this just because you don't like the way it's unfolding." Beth opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say whatever carefully crafted excuse she had been preparing, before she could spin the situation back into her favor, a voice from the head table cut through the tension, sharp and controlled, but laced with something dangerous, something unraveling, something on the verge of breaking apart. "Is this true?" The room stilled, heads turning toward the source of the voice, and there, seated beside my mother, was her new husband, staring at her with an expression that could no longer be mistaken for the casual indifference he had worn all evening. His jaw was tight, his hands folded neatly on the table in front of him, but his eyes were locked onto my mother with something close to disbelief, something close to suspicion, something close to the realization that the woman he had just married might not be the person he thought she was. My mother, to her credit, didn't react right away, her fingers gripping the stem of her champagne glass just a little too tightly, her smile frozen in place like she was trying to decide whether to deny it or laugh it off, whether to pretend it wasn't as bad as it sounded or double down on whatever excuse she had already crafted in her mind. But the hesitation, that split-second delay, that small, barely perceptible crack in her armor, was all it took for the doubt to settle, for the air in the room to shift, for the people watching to start seeing things differently, to start wondering what else she might be hiding. And I knew then that I wasn't done. Not yet, not when the perfect facade she had spent her entire life building was already starting to crumble, not when I had spent years swallowing down the things I had never said, the truths I had never spoken, the secrets I had been forced to carry alone. I turned to face her fully, tilting my head slightly, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the anticipation to build, just long enough for her to feel the weight of what was coming next, just long enough for her to realize that she was no longer in control. "You didn't just leave me out of the wedding," I said, my voice softer now, but somehow more dangerous, more lethal. "You didn't just forget about me, didn't just decide that I wasn't important enough to be here. You've been doing this my whole life, haven't you? Choosing Beth, pushing me aside, pretending that I didn't deserve the same love, the same attention, the same place in this family." She let out a quiet breath, but still, she said nothing. And then, without breaking eye contact, I reached into my purse and pulled out the one thing I knew would break her completely, the envelope. The one I had been holding onto for years, the one filled with the letters my father had written before he died, the ones my mother had hidden from me, the ones she had never wanted me to see. The silence was absolute. I didn't even have to open it. She knew what it was. Her husband, now looking at her with something close to disgust, cleared his throat, his voice tight, strained, barely containing the anger simmering beneath the surface. "What is that?" I smiled, slow and deliberate, my heart pounding with the kind of satisfaction I had never felt before, the kind that came with knowing, without a doubt, that I had won. "The truth," I said simply, before sliding the envelope across the table. My mother didn't move, didn't reach for it, didn't even try to defend herself, because she knew that no matter what she said, no matter how she tried to spin it, no matter how many lies she told to cover her tracks, the damage had already been done. And just like that, the wedding turned into a funeral. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced, thick and suffocating, pressing against my skin like something tangible, something alive, something waiting to sink its claws in and drag me down with it. My mother sat motionless at the head of the table, her fingers still curled around the stem of her champagne glass, her knuckles white with tension, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line as she stared at the envelope in front of her like it was a snake poised to strike. The guests, once lively, once cheerful, once celebrating the perfect wedding she had so carefully constructed, were frozen in place, their gazes darting between me and her, between the truth that had just been revealed and the woman who had spent her entire life burying it. For the first time since I had walked into that room, I felt something close to satisfaction settle in my chest, a slow, creeping warmth that spread through my veins as I watched the realization dawn on her husband's face, as I saw the exact moment he understood that the woman he had just married was not the woman he thought she was. His hand twitched at his side, his jaw clenched, his entire body radiating barely contained fury as he leaned forward, his voice dangerously low when he finally spoke. "Explain," he said, the single word sharp enough to cut through the heavy air, demanding, unrelenting, giving my mother no room to maneuver, no space to twist the truth into something more palatable, no opportunity to escape the consequences that were now crashing down around her. She exhaled slowly, deliberately, her expression carefully composed, but I could see the flicker of something else beneath the surface, something darker, something calculating, something I had spent my entire life learning to recognize. My mother was many things: cold, cruel, manipulative, but she was never unprepared, never without an exit strategy, never without one last move to play. And as I stood there, waiting for her to crumble, waiting for her to break beneath the weight of the truth, waiting for her to finally face the reality of what she had done, she did something I hadn't expected. She laughed. Soft at first, barely more than an exhale, then fuller, richer, the kind of laugh that sent an icy chill down my spine, the kind of laugh that told me she wasn't finished, that I hadn't won, that I had underestimated her one last time. She lifted her gaze to meet mine, amusement flickering behind her eyes, something knowing, something almost pitying, and when she finally spoke, her voice was smooth, steady, dripping with something that made my stomach twist in unease. "You think you know everything, don't you?" she said, tilting her head slightly, the ghost of a smile playing at the edges of her lips, her entire demeanor shifting from defensive to something much worse, something dangerous. You think you've finally uncovered all the secrets, that you've finally put all the pieces together, that you've finally taken something from me that I can't get back. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening, because this wasn't the reaction I had expected, wasn't the breakdown I had been waiting for, wasn't the moment of defeat I had been so sure was inevitable. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice quieter now, less certain, more wary, because suddenly I wasn't sure if I was still the one in control. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, folding her hands neatly in front of her, her eyes never leaving mine as she spoke, each word slow, deliberate, carefully chosen to land exactly where she wanted them to. You really think your father was the man you believed he was? She asked, and the second the words left her mouth, I felt my stomach drop, felt the ground shift beneath my feet, felt the first hints of doubt creep into the edges of my carefully constructed plan. I shook my head, refusing to let her pull me into whatever game she was trying to play, refusing to let her turn this back on me, refusing to let her rewrite the past in a way that absolved her of everything she had done. I don't care what you say, I said, my voice firm, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. He was a better parent than you ever were, and you know it. But my mother only smiled, slow and knowing, as if she had been waiting for me to say exactly that, as if she had known all along how this would end, as if she had let me believe I had won just so she could rip it away from me at the very last second. Did he ever tell you why he left? She asked, her voice so casual, so deceptively gentle, so unbearably smug that I wanted to scream. Did he ever tell you what really happened before he walked away? I felt the blood drain from my face, because no, he never had. My father had always been a quiet man, reserved, never one to speak ill of my mother, never one to linger on the past, never one to burden me with details I was too young to understand. I had spent years believing that he had left because he couldn't take her cruelty anymore, because he had finally seen her for what she was, because he had chosen to escape rather than let her poison consume him. But now, standing in that room, staring at the woman who had spent her entire life twisting the truth to suit her needs, I realized, too late, that there was something I hadn't considered. Maybe my father hadn't left because of her. Maybe he had left because of me. The thought struck me like a physical blow, a sharp, suffocating weight settling in my chest, and my mother must have seen it, must have sensed the shift, must have known exactly how to press the wound even deeper, because her voice softened just slightly, taking on the false sympathy of someone pretending to be concerned, pretending to care, pretending to hold some terrible burden she had carried all these years. There's so much you don't know, she murmured, shaking her head slowly, the smile never leaving her face, her satisfaction barely concealed beneath the surface. But don't worry, darling. You wanted the truth, didn't you? Well, now you'll have to live with it. The guests were still watching, still waiting, still trying to piece together what had just happened, but I couldn't hear them anymore, couldn't see them, couldn't focus on anything except the sinking, horrible realization that she had done it again, that she had managed to turn everything upside down in a single breath, that no matter how much I had thought I had won, no matter how much I had prepared, no matter how much I had planned for this moment, she had still beaten me. Because revenge is sweet. But it comes at a price.